From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome once more. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today, K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek. During our first half hour, Gregg offering a more in-depth look at parasite control for cattle destined for summer pasture. He'll take a look, of course, at fly control and a thing or two you producers might not have known about the performance of those insecticidal ear tags. He'll also cover internal parasite control, which deworming products have proven effective and which have come up short. Gregg addresses all of that next. Also, today's agricultural news headlines are ahead. Later on then, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton on ornamental gardening in those shady locations around the landscape. That and more right here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're back now on Agriculture Today and on another timely subject in the area of bovine health management. Aboard once more from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit with that laboratory, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, we're going to examine closely today several things that producers may or may not know about internal and external parasite control for cattle as they head out on grass. And now is the time to firm up one's control plans, right?
Absolutely. One of the good things, or one of the many good things about living in the Midwest and being a cow-calf producer is we can forget about flies and internal parasites or worms during part of the year, unlike our colleagues down in the southeast part of the United States. But yeah, spring is when we start thinking about how to control our flies and how we minimize pasture contamination with our internal parasites or our worms.
Well, let's start with that fly control. You have a number that points out how enormous expenditures are on this part of management.
It's amazing, but the last survey that I saw, cow-calf operators spend about $2 billion per year on fly control. So flies are a major issue, and it's obvious that producers take it seriously.
And why they're an issue, it pays to review the troubles that flies cause to cattle on grass.
There's 5 major flies that we deal with, but really there's 2 that we're the most concerned with, the phase flies. And it's important to understand the difference between our flies. And phase flies are not blood feeders. They're the ones you see on the face, and they feed off the eye juices and the secretions around the nose. And they buzz in, get a feeding, and then they leave and come back and forth and go on and on. The other fly that we're really concerned about is the horn fly, and that it's called a horn fly, but it's the ones we see on the backs and the sides of the cows and the bulls. And they are blood feeders. We don't think that they're major contributors to disease spread, but they take 20 to 40 meals a day. So each time they do that, they're piercing that skin. And they are a tremendous irritation to our herds when their numbers get up to certainly 100 to 200 per animals when we start seeing negative effects.
The horn flies are greatly detrimental in performance. The face flies, of course, can be the instigators of pink eye.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. Face flies, we get enough of those flies with their little raspy mouth parts feeding on the eyes. They'll lacerate the cornea, and they explain a lot of reasons why we have pink eye outbreaks in the pasture. And then, like I said, the horn flies, reduced average daily gain, immunity issues, just because animals aren't grazing and they're just constantly irritated and trying to fight the flies off.
Well, Gregg, insecticidal ear tags are still the control approach of choice?
They are. There's pour-ons and there's sprays and there's back rubbers and all kinds of things, but insecticide fly tags are the primary way that producers are going to try to control flies. And there's some things to talk about when we talk about using fly tags. One is a lot of good research has shown that if you're going to use them, start using them in the cows first, and then if you have to, put them in the calves, but also research has shown that 2 tags are vastly more effective than 1 tag per animal. So they're not that expensive, so we highly recommend 1 in each ear as we go to pasture.
But are they effective against the 2 primary fly species?
Well, that's a great point. You would think that they'd be very effective against the face fly because they're right up there on the face. But again, because the female face fly is the only one that feeds, she comes in, takes a meal, and then she leaves, and so she's never exposed to the insecticide for very long. The ear tags are very effective against horn flies because they spend their entire time on the animal, and the only time that the female leaves is when she goes and lays her eggs in fresh manure. And so they're just exposed to the insecticide more. So there is a difference.
And there's always the question that comes up about the duration of the insecticide that is drenched upon that product, how long it'll be effective.
Absolutely. Our best tags are only going to be effective for 3 to 5 months. And during that whole time, the amount of insecticide is decreasing. So in time, what we're selecting for at the end of the season are those flies that are most susceptible to the insecticide. So, yeah, they're pretty short duration products.
But moreover, the big talking point in recent years, resistance buildup in fly populations to insecticides of all classes of ear tags?
Basically, at least our organophosphates and our pyrethroids. There's 3 classes: pyrethroids, organophosphates, and then macrocyclic lactones. Organophosphates and pyrethroids, we do see fly resistance, and so it's important that if producers are using those products that, number one, they rotate the ingredient, not the trade name, not the naming insecticide, but for instance, year 1 we'd use an organophosphate. Next year we'd look at a product and pick a pyrethroid. The next year we'd use a macrocyclic lactone. Some people want to use a 2-tag rotation, and what we'd recommend there is use a pyrethroid the first year, a pyrethroid the second year, and then pick an organophosphate product the third year. And if we keep those rotations going, we're never going to select for one fly or not as far as resistance. So that really helps reduce the amount of resistance that we see. But
again, a pyrethroid 2 years in a row, then an organophosphate, but not the other way around?
Yeah, the research is pretty clear that you have to go pyrethroid, then organophosphate. And there are some products out there that have both organophosphate and pyrethroids, but there are some entomologists that have looked at that, and overall, at least to my understanding, the recommendation is to stay away from the combinations because of the resistance issue.
Now, there is an ingested product, the growth regulator products that are often administered or made available to the herd as it goes out onto grass or during grazing season. Are they effective?
They are. They're great products. There's we call them pass-through. One basically kills the larva that's in the manure, and the other one just prevents them from molting and becoming adults. Now, in order for those products to work, they have to be around the eggs and the larvae that are in the manure. Not all flies lay their eggs in the manure. Horn flies do. They have to lay it in fresh manure pats. Face flies do also, but face flies lay them other places too. So for our pass-through, our IGRs and our larvicides, very effective against horn flies. Not bad effectiveness against face flies, but they will have no effect on our deer flies or stable flies because they don't lay their eggs in the manure.
But if you're going to use those, they have to be administered promptly here.
Absolutely. The recommendation is start feeding those products 2 to 3 weeks before the major fly season to make sure that we have enough concentration going through those cows.
Before we move on to other parasites, the tag, not now, but later on, remember to remove those to keep from lending to the resistance problem.
Absolutely. I know we beat up producers every year about it, but it really is important to remove those tags at the end of the year and dispose of them. Don't let them lay around. And the reason we promote that is at the end of the year, the amount of insecticide in those tags is so minute that even if a fly lands on it, it's only going to kill those flies that are the most susceptible. And those flies that are resistant are going to be the ones that are making the next generations of flies as we go through time. So removing those tags absolutely getting them out of the facility is one of the ways to reduce resistance that we're seeing in the flies.
So keep that reminder in pocket as the grazing season ends and the cattle are pulled back in. You are concerned about potential and severe tick outbreak this year, which can afflict cattle health.
We are hearing, and I'm experiencing it at home, it seems like there's an awful lot of ticks this spring. And absolutely, we're always concerned about ticks. In Kansas and the Midwest, we know they're a major player in anaplasmosis spread. These ticks can carry a lot of different human diseases, Lyme disease, and et cetera. So we are concerned about tick control. Unfortunately, our products or the way that we go about managing flies are not all that effective against ticks. And I'm just going to pass along a little information that I've gotten from some really sharp livestock entomologists who have told me that if you control the red cedars in your pasture, you're going to do a really good job of controlling the tick population. For some reason, that's where they like to hibernate or live or do whatever they do. And so we need to control those organisms also. Well,
we didn't need an extra reason for controlling cedars, but this is a great one to add to the rationale for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, that covers the external side of the insect pest story. For cattle heading to grass, Gregg, we do want to take a look at the internal side, get into product selection and strategy for applying those products against worms in particular. We'll do that after the break, and we would also steer folks in the direction of information that's been compiled by a colleague here at K-State, Cassandra Olds, veterinary entomologist, on bucking the trend of insecticide resistance in beef cattle herds, and you can find that, and it's good reading, in the Beef Tips newsletter series. Just go to ksubeef.org and look for that article, again found in the Beef Tips newsletter series. Gregg Hanzlicek of the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State is our guest, and we'll return with him after these moments away. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Resuming now on Agriculture Today, our conversation with Gregg Hanzlicek over from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. Gregg has joined us for a more detailed look at pesticide control for cattle destined for summer pasture soon. And we covered, Gregg, fly and tick management earlier. Let's now turn to internal parasites, and that constitutes largely worm populations, right?
Yep, we call them internal parasites, but producers know we call them worms and dewormers and wormers. And they are worms that live in these animals. There's no doubt about that.
You would like producers, as they think about their control approaches, to understand the life cycle of these worms, though.
It's very important that producers do understand the life cycle, and we'll just start, it's kind of the chicken and the egg, but we'll start with the adult worm that she's going to live in either the abomasum or the intestines of the cow. She's going to attach there and either be a blood feeder or just absorb nutrients, but eventually she's going to start producing eggs, and then the eggs are going to be passed in the manure. It's going to be in the pasture. Those eggs will hatch. They typically go through about 3 molting stages. And then once they get to those stages, then they start moving away from the manure pad into the grass. And then an animal, cow or a calf, comes along and is eating the grass. They become infected with the larvae. The larvae go to the abomasum and the intestine. They become adults. Then they start producing eggs. And so it's a constant cycle. Most of the worms in a herd are actually in the pasture. 80 to 90% of the worms are in the pasture. Only a small percentage are actually in the animals themselves.
And it's difficult to remove them from that pasture setting?
It's impossible to remove them. And even in places like Montana, North Dakota, places like that, they have worms that overwinter in those cold temperatures. So they're They can be hardy. You're not going to get rid of worms.
So control is of the essence here. Before we talk of those options, you say that mature animals will at some point develop immunity to the ill effects of these worms?
Absolutely. Once bovine gets to about a year and a half of age, they will have developed an immunity to the worms, meaning they will still have them. They'll still be internal, but they'll be kept at a level that's not detrimental to that particular animal. They're still the carriers, so they're still producing eggs that go out in the manure that are exposing our young calves to the worms, and that's where our negative effects are going to be seen, are in our young calves that become infected for the first time.
So there's obviously just cause for control. 5 classes of dewormers, you say?
Yeah, there's 5 major classes of internal parasite dewormers that we use in the United States.
Now, talk about their differences, their duration, some of the other variables that would be important to the producer then.
Well, the main thing is that we're seeing resistance in 3 of those classes, and all of those, to my knowledge, are injectables and or pour-ons. There's a what we call a white dewormer, which is an oral liquid product. I don't believe that we're seeing resistance in that product, but we certainly are in some of the injectables and the pour-ons.
So producers need to scrutinize their choices here?
Yes, absolutely. And really the only way to know whether our deworming program is working or not is to do some testing. For our fly control, we just go out in the pasture, and if our animals have a lot of flies on them, we know our program isn't working. The only way we can do that on internal parasites is actually do what's called a fecal egg count reduction test. And that it's simple to do. 10 manure samples from 10 different animals on the day that we deworm, and then go back, and basically you're only going to have to do the same animals. Go back 14 days later, take 10 manure samples, and then have a laboratory they're going to count how many eggs per gram of feces. And if you don't have a 90 to 95% reduction between the first sample and the second sample, that means your program's probably not very effective.
So then, Greg, what can one do to shore up their management and control program here through various decisions? Well,
there's some things that can do to make sure that we're more effective is that, one, try to select different products when we're controlling for external and internal. That'll help the effectiveness of both. If we are going to use a product or products that are labeled for both flies and internal parasites, it's good to use a combination of drugs, and that way our effectiveness is going to increase in those things.
And you say that in addition to that, accurate dosage weighs in here.
Absolutely. So we know that we're talking about any of it, whether it's injectables or pour-ons or oral, if we are dosing the average animal in the herd, average weight of the animal, we're going to underdose all those that are over the average, that are way more than our average is. And so most of the time we're not going to weigh every animal and adjust our dosage. So if we're going to do it on a herd basis, really what we'd recommend is that we use the average of the heaviest animals in the herd and dose everybody according to that. Yes, we are overdosing a little bit to the smaller animals, but at least we're not underdosing and reducing our effectiveness in the heavier animals. So that's a good thing to think about as we move forward.
All right. And you wanted to visit about this, that it's an idea that's getting around out there, you say, the concept of a worm refuge, to put it in that term?
Yep, that's what it is. The term is refugia, and the concept is that we want a population of worms in the cows and the pasture that are susceptible to our products so that our products remain to be effective. And there's several ways to do that. One of the most common recommendations is you don't deworm anybody over 5 years of age. Now, we talked about 5 years of age, they'll have an immunity, so they're not going to carry many worms anyway. Mm-hmm. But the thought is if we don't deworm them, every time they put eggs into the pasture, those eggs and larvae will be susceptible to our products. So we're not selecting for resistant organisms. The other thinking is don't deworm animals that look healthy and are the heaviest in the group. The thinking in there is they're not heavily parasitized with internal parasites anyway, so let's don't deworm them. again, they're going to provide a population that's susceptible to our products. So that's come around about the last 2 or 3 years. It's you'll hear more and more people talking about it as we move forward.
You just put it out there for consideration as producers think about this.
I do. I just put it out there for consideration. There's all kinds of opinions that we all have about that theory, but just so producers understand what it actually is.
We'll tie it off with this, and this has been brought up a time or two as we've talked. Knowing the effectiveness of one's control approach is paramount here to your effort, and how to evaluate that.
Yep, so that's that fecal egg count reduction test, and there's been some recent research to show that there are differences in our products as far as effectiveness. And the last really good study that I showed, the effectiveness, the egg count reduction went anywhere from 18% all the way up to 99%. We talked about how our goal is 90 to 95, so
18% is a little shy of that.
18%, we're not doing much control there, and at least this study, that 18% came from generic topical dewormers. And I'm just going to throw that out there as a really well done study that was done down in the southeast part of the United States.
But producers need to have something in mind to evaluate that product, whatever they're using. That's the point.
Absolutely. If they're going to use that product or any product doing that fecal egg count reduction, like I said, it's inexpensive, it's easy to do. Then there won't be any questions about whether your program is working. And because of the resistance that we're seeing, it's not going to be unlikely that a producer will have to change their program at least occasionally as they move through the years.
And that also lends to good stewardship of the products, as you're saying. And the last thing here is that producers need to map out a plan. That sounds like perhaps overkill, but it really isn't, Greg.
No, you're exactly right. A plan on what product I'm going to use, what chemical, timing, when we're going to do it, who we're going to actually use these products on. All those things, like you said, should be not just willy-nilly, just grab something and go, but should be thought about, planned. I always recommend conversing with your local practitioner. They can guide you on internal and external parasite control better than anybody else can, for sure.
Do bring that local veterinarian into the conversation, that's for certain. Good overview of a topic that couldn't be more timely as we have pasture season just about to commence here in Kansas. Greg, thanks for coming over, as always. He's Gregg Hanzlicek, the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit out of the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory at Kansas State University. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about the lab and its services in analyzing all manner of bovine and other animal health issues, you can touch base with the lab via their website, ksvdl.org. You are listening to Agriculture Today, and now we'll stand aside for a few moments. When we return, today's agricultural news headlines are coming your way. That'll include this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Greg Akagi visits with a K-State weed control specialist about an assortment of things. And again, for our horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton awaits with ideas on gardening in the shade. That's all still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. Please keep it right here.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Agriculture Today continues here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you once more. Glad to have you along as we turn now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, for the fourth time, Iowa lawmakers have approved restrictions aimed at stopping animal welfare activists from documenting without consent activity at livestock operations. The Iowa House passed the latest bill Monday night. The state Senate approved it last week. The bill received bipartisan support in both chambers, and it's likely to be signed by Governor Kim Reynolds, who has supported such efforts in the past. An Iowa law passed back in 2012 was struck down by the courts as an unconstitutional violation of free speech rights. Legal challenges to a second attempt resulted in a judge halting enforcement until a final decision was made in federal court, and another law passed last year that is in force now allows someone to be charged with criminal trespassing for entering an operation without consent. Now, this latest bill in Iowa would expand restrictions by making it an aggravated misdemeanor to enter private property without the consent of the owner and taking samples of soil or water or animal products. It would also criminalize placing a camera or other surveillance devices on the property. Conviction would be a sentence of up to 2 years in prison. A second offense could be prosecuted as a felony and carry a sentence of up to 5 years behind bars. Such laws have been around since the 1990s, but lawmakers in many agricultural states have stepped up their efforts in recent years to give producers tools to go after activists. States that have passed such laws include Alabama, Missouri, Montana, and North Dakota. And all sides in a legal challenge to California's Proposition 12 laid out their cases during oral arguments in a federal court yesterday. Agriculture groups have argued that that state's law placing animal welfare restrictions on hog producers who sell pork in the state violates the Commerce Clause by regulating hog producers in other states. The law requires hog producers to abide by certain regulations in order to sell pork in California. Voters in that state passed Proposition 12 in 2018 with a nearly 63% support. The law forbids the sale of whole pork meat in California from hogs born of sows not housed in conformity with the law. An attorney for two national agriculture groups told a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in Pasadena, California, that when the law takes effect next January, it will distort the hog market as a result of added costs to producers to comply. As of January 1 of next year, Proposition 12 prohibits the sale of pork not produced according to California standards. It would apply to any uncooked pork sold in the state regardless of whether it was raised in California. Now, according to the National Pork Producers Council, less than 1% of pork produced in the U.S. meets Proposition 12 requirements. The NPPC has argued that because the state must import most of its pork, Proposition 12 essentially regulates farmers beyond their state borders. USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack is now calling for more incentives for producers to boost conservation efforts. Here's a look at that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Farmers are generally excellent stewards of the land, could be even bigger contributors to improving the environment, but there's a major roadblock for them. This from Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack. He told a House Appropriations hearing on Wednesday.
We have 45 different practices that we know will have a positive impact on soil health, have a positive impact on water quality, will have a positive impact on carbon sequestration. Farmers are anxious to do it.
But there's just one problem with that.
They're not making enough money, most of them, to do that.
Just under 90% of U.S. farmers don't derive even half their income from the farm. It has to come from outside jobs. So Vilsack says to help them and to help boost conservation efforts,
let's create markets that reward them for doing this and pay them for doing this and create, in essence, a new revenue stream for them,
which might make their farms more profitable. Vilsack says profit, that's what more farmers need to stay in business and provide a stable food supply for the nation. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Next up, this week's installment of the Kansas Soybean Update, and waiting with that, as always, is Gregg Hanzlicek. Greg?
Dr. Sarah Lancaster is joining us. She's an assistant professor and extension specialist at Kansas State University. Dr. Lancaster, I know that you have been very busy throughout this time. What are some of the things that you're working on right at the moment?
We are busy finalizing our plans for the field research season, wrapping up greenhouse experiments for some of my grad students. We're looking at some various herbicide evaluation trials this spring, but I'm really excited about some of the non-chemical weed control trials I'm going to get to be part of this spring. We've got one that's going to be in the eastern part of the state, looking at cover crop termination timing and planting green versus terminating cover crops a couple of weeks ahead of time, and then how planting data interacts with that. So excited to see some data out of that because that's a pretty hot topic. And then another interesting trial that we're laying the groundwork for, we're going to do some on-farm work in central Kansas looking at non-chemical rescue treatments, things like weed electrocution. So I think that'll be an interesting study and just pretty timely stuff as we think about this prevalence of herbicide resistance.
For soybean growers out there, as we get into the growing season, what are some of the issues we're seeing them face right now?
So one of the things that has been kind of a big conversation here this spring has been potential supply issues with herbicides. So throughout the spring, as I've been visiting with various reps from the chemical companies, I've been asking kind of what is their view on the supply situation. And almost without fail, they've talked about the fact that there could be some disruptions largely related to logistical issues associated with the COVID-19 situations. In most cases, it sounds like the product has been produced and it is somewhere, but it's probably going to take a while to get that product to where growers need it. I don't say these things to cause alarm. I say these things to encourage growers to be proactive and plan ahead and to try to secure your product as soon as possible. No need to be irrational about it, but just try to be very proactive and also, think about having a plan B. For most of the herbicides that we use, we have a lot of different formulations that have the same or similar active ingredients. And so it'll be important for folks to take a look at what are some of those alternatives that maybe they hadn't considered before, just so they're ready in case they have a hiccup with their supplier.
Sarah, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Good to join you.
That is Sarah Lancaster, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist at Kansas State University, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Many thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there, and as a matter of fact, we plan to have K-State's Sarah Lancaster, Mike side with us tomorrow to dig deeper into this welling up concern about herbicide availability to you producers this spring and how to respond to that. We'll be back with this week's horticulture segment after this break. This is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Closing out this Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture feature for you. And this is once more a preview of the next installment in what's become a wildly successful series put on by the Department of Horticulture and Recreational Resources at Kansas State University, the K-State Garden Hour webinar series. The next is coming up this coming Wednesday, April the 21st, over the noon hour. The topic will be gardening in the shade. And the presenter, our guest now, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent Dennis Patton. Dennis, gardening in the shade, it's not something to avoid. It's actually something that you would suggest homeowners could embrace.
That's right. Everyone knows what it feels like to be in the shade on a hot Kansas day as opposed to outside gardening in the full sun. And so gardening in the shade is a great way to take advantage of that, bring another dimension into your garden, and also sometimes maybe solve some of those problem sites because a lot of people can't grow grass under trees. And the big question then becomes, what do you do in that shade? For the most part, we are talking about ornamentals. We're talking about some flowers, some shrubs to fill in those areas because, all plants need sun to grow because it's the basis of photosynthesis. that sunlight. But there are some plants that are what we call shade tolerant. They're able to function better in low light situations. And, one of the drawbacks when it does come to plant selections is a lot of times shade loving plants are not going to have as many flowers. For a plant to put out a flower, it has to be a higher functioning plant to produce that flower. So unfortunately, a lot of our shade gardens really become more about texture, color of the foliage, those type of things that create the interest and make a pleasing garden setting.
For most folks, understandably, as you're suggesting here, plant selection is priority one, but you would like to have homeowners think about a few other things first before getting to that step.
That's correct. In Kansas, when we think about shade, we normally think about under a tree, but we can also have shade cast from our buildings, from our houses, from overhangs, from outbuildings, from fences, those type of things. But shade from a tree tends to be our number one concern. And so when we garden under a tree, not all trees are created equal. Some have some very fibrous root systems, a lot of the maples, some of them have more diffused. And one of the things we need to think about when we're gardening under a tree is we got to protect the tree. Because if we add soil under that tree, we cut through a lot of those major roots, then we could actually be harming the tree and causing some problems for its long-term growth. So we need to learn to kind of garden with the trees, not against the trees. And in some cases, it may be a losing battle. If it's a really knit, fibrous root system, you may need to back away from that trunk of the tree a little bit more, or just kind of find those pockets where you can put those plants in around the root system of the tree itself.
Thinking about that from the other direction, though, the competition from those tree roots to your planted material, that's something you have to factor in as well.
Right. So the other thing that goes in hand with shade a lot of times in Kansas is dry shade, because the canopy of that tree acts like a big umbrella. And when you do get rainfall, it kind of tends to fall to the side, or a lot of it gets stuck up, so to speak, into the canopy and never reaches the ground. So kind of before you ever get to the plants is kind of deciding, is this going to be a drier location? Or am I going to water this garden? As it goes without saying, the more water you put into your shade garden, your array of plant materials gets bigger. If you go very dry, your plant material selection is going to go down a little bit. And then the other thing to think about is not all shades created equal. You've got something like a honey locust tree that you get some really nice filtered light through, as opposed to a big old oak tree or a big old maple tree. I mean, it's dense, it's dark under there. So, here again, you need to kind of assess your situation, because there are some plants that will take a little bit more sun. There's some that will take a little less sun. And sometimes I hate to say this because this is not the typical extension, tried and true recommendation, but it's gardening. And sometimes you just got to go trial and error. Put that plant in there. If it works, great. If it doesn't, give it a couple years, then maybe move it out into a more sunny location or another location itself. So, we sometimes joke that true gardeners, their plants are on wheels because they're always moving around. And sometimes with a shade garden, you just got to find that niche, because there could be that little ray of sunshine coming in there. Or the other thing is, over time, that tree grows, and what was a little bit of light sun now maybe becomes more heavier shade. So it's never static dealing with shade in a shade garden.
What about, Dennis, and you hit upon this to a certain extent, soil improvement in that shaded area? Is that an extra consideration here?
As I said earlier, we don't really want to bring in a couple inches of topsoil because it's heavy. It can suffocate the tree. But what you might want to do is bring in some compost, where you can work into the soil, create, instead of, in a lot of gardens, we till up the entire area. In a shade garden under existing tree, you just may want to improve pockets where those plants are going to go in, and bringing that compost in is going to help do that. And then with any garden, kind of the finishing touches is a nice layer of like a wood chip mulch, 2-3 inches deep, that's going to help conserve some moisture. It's going to cover up some of those surface roots that people a lot of times are trying to avoid dealing with. So yeah, it's better to bring in organic matter, light, fluffy, airy, as opposed to topsoil, which can be clay, heavy, and cause some suffocation of the tree roots itself.
Point is, those shady areas can be brightened up with strategic plant selection and site preparation, all of what you've talked about today. And Dennis, you'll be availing yourself to answer more questions from homeowners on this topic of gardening in the shade at that upcoming K-State Garden Hour webinar. How do folks take part in that?
You know, to me, the simplest way is you just go to your search engine and put in K-State Garden Hour, and that will bring you directly to the link. There is a registration process you have to go through, and then you'll get a link that you can log in at noon on Wednesdays for the K-State Garden Hour, and mine is next Wednesday on the 21st. And once you're signed up, you just log in, and then there's a chat feature. You can put questions in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible and go into a lot more detail than we did in this radio interview.
You bet. Be part of it. The K-State Garden Hour, the next edition taking place, as Dennis said, this coming Wednesday, April the 21st at noon. Search for it at K-State Garden Hour. Just that simple. Dennis, good luck with that presentation. Thanks for sharing some highlights from it with us today.
Glad to share, and looking forward to presenting next week on the 21st.
Dennis Patton there, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent, with us on this week's Horticulture segment. Closing out our Thursday edition. We'll be back this same time tomorrow and hope you will be as well. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.